Well, hello, Harvest Assembly. It's great to have you with us this morning virtually. And it is now May. We are now rolling into kind of getting into that summer weather. I know today is a high of 71, which is something that I personally enjoy. But before we get into the message today, I just want to give you some announcements. We just want to thank everyone for being faithful in their tithes and their giving and their offerings. You guys have been such a blessing to Harvest Assembly, and we are overflowed with gratitude because of that. We are on track literally with everything in our budget, and we are just so thankful that you continue to pour out your giving in means of monetary giving, because we are just so blessed by that as a church, and we continue to go forward because of that. And it's only because of you, and it's the heart that you have for the kingdom, and we are just so thankful for you. So we appreciate you, and just continue on with your tithes and your giving. We're actually going to have a collection this Tuesday at 10 a.m. So if you want to drop off those tithes and offerings here at Tuesday at 10 a.m., we are going to be practicing social distancing within that. And also if you have any food pantry items, you can drop those off as well. So we just, again, want to thank you so much. You guys have just been a huge blessing, and really continue to show your hospitality and your heart for the Father in this process. Also, if you have anything that you need to drop off at the church or anything like that, just contact me or Pastor Clay, and we'll get with you on that. And we just are so thankful for everything that you guys have done and continue to do through this process of quarantining and staying home and everything like that. So we're just so thankful. But we're going to continue on this morning, and we are still in our series from beginning to end, and we are focusing on the story of Joseph. And Pastor Clay talked last week about Joseph and Potiphar's wife and everything that happened in there, and this week we're just going to continue on, and just want to remember that when Joseph fled, you can imagine that he was probably pretty scared and pretty concerned, and he got put into prison. But God was taking care of him the whole entire time, and so that's kind of where we're going to pick up. And but before we really get into all that, because we're going to be in chapter 40 today in Genesis, and this is kind of like a dream chapter, you know? Well, dream chapter part 1, I guess. But have you ever had any weird dreams? I tell Clay my dreams all the time that I have, and they're like really vivid. There has been some times to where like I've had dreams of me and Ronda Rousey were best friends, and she taught me like all these like judo throws and stuff. And so that's one of the dreams that I had. Anyways, but I guess it just shows some of my hobbies coming through in my dreams. I love watching MMA. But have you ever had like a dream that like you remember, or like a dream from your childhood and you're like, oh gosh, that was just really weird? I do. So I mean, I have a couple dreams that I remember from my childhood, but this one, and like specifically, I was in the woods. Like, it was me and my dad. We were mushroom hunting, and the irony of this is morel mushrooms are popping up right now. So but in my dream, when I was a child, I don't remember how old I was, but me and my dad, we were mushroom hunting. And I mean, I would always say this phrase in real life: Dad, I wish that mushrooms could be as big as trees so we could see them easier, and we could just chop them down with a chainsaw and take them back home, and we would have mushrooms for days. And so in my dream, that actually came true. We were walking through this forest, and we couldn't find any morel mushrooms. And we were looking on the ground, and we couldn't see any. We could see other mushrooms, but they weren't morel mushrooms. Until we looked up into the trees, and we saw like literal bushes and like trees that were human size of morel mushrooms. And I couldn't believe my eyes, and even to this day, I still wish it was true. I mean, I love morel mushrooms, like dust them in a little flour, fry them in butter, absolutely delicious, and a little bit of salt. But that was my dream, and I woke up remembering, if only that could be true. And even to this day, I wish it could be true. And now, I mean, I don't know about you, if you've ever went morel mushroom hunting, like people are like have got and continue to get morel mushrooms that are huge, like you know, all the sizes. And so, but have you had any weird dreams that you remember from your childhood? And that's going to kind of set the tone today, because we are going to be kind of like going through some dreams, not in a weird way, but just kind of addressing these dreams. And Joseph actually interprets two prisoners' dreams. Now, I don't think that my dream necessarily needed to be interpreted past that. I love morel mushrooms. I wish that they were bigger so I could eat more of them. That's my interpretation of it. But in Joseph's story, we're in Genesis 40, and this is kind of where we pick up. I'm going to read a portion of this. I'm going to start in verse 1, and it says, sometime after this, so after Joseph was a prisoner, and after in chapter 39, in verse 21, it says, but the Lord was with Joseph in the prison, in the captain of the guard, and was shown him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight in the keeper of prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of the prisoners who were in prison. And whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. And the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made him succeed. And so that's kind of where we're picking off today, and that's where we're starting in our story in chapter 40. So, verse 1, chapter 40, sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. The Pharaoh was angry with these two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph, who is the keeper, appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended to them and continued to attend to them for some time in custody. So we have Joseph literally taking on all the responsibility of the keeper in the prison. And the captain of the guard is saying, here, Joseph, here's more responsibility. Here, Joseph, here's more responsibility. And it's interesting because Joseph was in the place to where, like, he was familiar and he knew that God was with him, but yet he was still in prison. And it was almost like every responsibility that he was given was kind of like almost an affirmation that, yep, the Lord your God is with you. The Lord your God entrusts you with this. The Lord your God is with you. And now Joseph gets entrusted with the cupbearer and the baker. And it says that Joseph was attending to the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. What I find interesting in this, in verse 2, it says the Pharaoh was angry with these officers. And if you go back up into chapter 31, it says that Potiphar was angry with Joseph. And so you see that there are some similarities here. That Pharaoh was angry with the cupbearer and the baker, and Potiphar was angry with Joseph. So when they came to meet one another, and I'm sure that they shared stories, they could probably share stories of how they got in there. People that they had served and people that they were attending to got angry with them, and that's how they ended in prison. So, and it says that he continued for some time in the custody, and Joseph continued to attend to them. And so, sometime, what is that sometime? I don't know. It's a while. But we can imagine that Joseph got to know and to understand and to kind of get close with as confidants and friends in the cupbearer and the baker, and got to know their habits, got to know their mood swings, got to know their behaviors, and was observant of them. And we can see that going into this next paragraph, because it says that Joseph observed when they were troubled. And so as Joseph is serving them, he's also observing them. And through his observation, God is using him in order to speak to these two individuals, and also speaking to Joseph himself. Joseph was the attendant, and he was observant, and he noticed the cupbearers and the bakers in distress. And so in verse 5, we'll continue to pick up here. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker and the baker of Egypt, who were confined in prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. And when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. He asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces so downcast today?" And they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So in this portion, we have this first mention of Joseph addressing God, speaking about God and speaking to who God is in this story. And because of Joseph, it's like if we were just to read the story, we would see that God would be the interpreter of dreams. He would be the one that we could go to and we could seek. But what is interesting is we don't see this in the story of Joseph before this point. And so it kind of leads us to ask the question, well, how does Joseph know that God interprets dreams? And now if we remember where Joseph came from, we'll know that Jacob is Joseph's father. And Jacob had a dream of his own in Genesis chapter 28. And Jacob's dream, when he was laying and fell into a deep sleep, God told him that his offspring was going to fill the earth, and that God's people were going to be descendants throughout the entire earth. And when Joseph awoke from the dream, he said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And so you have this magnificent dream from Jacob, Joseph's dad, and this is the dream that kind of sets the stage for Jacob's offspring. Now, if Joseph is Jacob's offspring, and Jacob was so moved by his dream and God communicating and talking to him through this dream, and this is what Jacob's vow to God was in chapter 28 in verse 20. "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I can come to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone that I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and all that I have I give you." So Jacob was saying in this moment, before he had any children, he's saying, "All that I have I give you. God, I'm trusting in you. I believe that this dream is going to come to pass because you have spoke it to me, and you have confirmed that to me." Fast forward now, when Joseph, Jacob's son, is in prison, and it said that Joseph was 17 when this whole scene happened with his brothers and him being taken captive. Now, if a dream was so impactful to Jacob, I'm sure that he would have told his sons about the dream that he had, and how much he stressed that they have children of their own so that Jacob's offspring can be descendants throughout the whole entire world and literally multiply. And so God's chosen people can inherit the earth. This was something that was probably ingrained into Joseph in the story of Joseph's family ever since Joseph was a small child. And so this idea and this aspect of a dream was not far off from, it was not so disconnected from who God is. Joseph could understand that if someone had a dream and they didn't understand it and it impacted them, he could understand the aspect of, well, why not ask God about your dream? Because I know that God gave my dad a dream. Why couldn't he give you a dream? And why couldn't he speak through you through that? Now, does God speak to us in every single dream that we have? You know what? I don't know. But in this case, it was very clear that God was speaking to the cupbearer and to the baker and was using Joseph in this. And Joseph was in this time of waiting, and he probably asked himself, God, I don't necessarily know what to do in this time except to be responsible for the things that you made me responsible over. And Joseph was in a new land. He was around different people. He literally got his normalcy stripped away from him when someone did him wrong, and now he is in prison for something he didn't do. Joseph probably experienced anger, sadness, frustration, and a multitude of emotions. Haven't me and you been there? Haven't me and you been to a place to where we don't necessarily know what's going on? We know God is doing something, but we're frustrated in the midst of it. And this is very possible where Joseph could be. And now Joseph is caring for the cupbearer and the baker of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and they're having these dreams, and Joseph remembers that dreams, like, we can ask God what those mean. And if they have a meaning, great. If they don't, great. But we can see that Joseph was saying, do not interpretations belong to God. And Joseph goes on to ask the cupbearer and the baker what their dreams are. And in this instance, God gave Joseph the knowledge about these specific dreams in order to interpret them. And Joseph sought God in their trouble. Joseph didn't seek God because he wanted something from them. Joseph sought God because they were troubled and he cared for them. And he literally spent time day after day after day attending to the cupbearer and attending to the baker. And so Joseph cared and he didn't want them to be troubled. And so he literally asked God what these dreams meant on their behalf. And it kind of speaks to us because we can seek God in other people's troubles. Now, are we the one to interpret other people's troubles for them? I don't think so. But we can seek God into how to understand other people's troubles so we can have empathy for them. So maybe when we're in conversation with someone who's just feeling troubled, who's feeling downcast, that God will give us the wisdom and the knowledge to help them in their time of need. And that is exactly what happened with Joseph here and the cupbearer and the baker in this story. Joseph sought God for other people in their trouble because he cared for them. And I don't know about you, but there's a lot of things going on in this world today that we could possibly be troubled about. And there's a lot of things that we think that, you know what, I've just got to get up and I got to do it myself. And in this story, specifically, it shows us that Joseph was relying on God. He was relying on Yahweh, the one true God. And he didn't say, oh, hey, I can interpret these dreams for you, because I heard about all these dreams that my family had. I guess I can interpret them for you. No, he said, let's leave this up to God. So any responsibility that he was given, literally any responsibility he was given, he was literally lifting it up and saying that, God, this is for you. God, I give this to you. It's this constant, like, if you get something, you're giving it to God. And that's almost the posture that we are learning from Joseph by reading this story. And so Joseph goes on to interpret these dreams. The cupbearer's dream was favorable, actually, and it said, it basically, like, I'm not going to read the whole dream in both of the dreams, but you can read that in chapter 40 if you would like. But the cupbearer had a good dream, right? The interpretation of the cupbearer's dream was just like, hey, you're gonna be released and kind of be reinstated to where you were at. Good job, kudos. And the baker overheard that interpretation, and he was super stoked. He was just like, hey, he had a great dream. He had a good interpretation. I'm going to go and ask Joseph what my dream meant, because if he had a good one and he was troubled about it and he's not troubled anymore, it means maybe I can have a good interpretation. Unfortunately, that wasn't true for the baker, and unfortunately, Pharaoh's anger still burned against the baker, and within a certain amount of days, the baker was hung. And that's the end of the baker's story. But there's a key thing that Joseph asks the cupbearer when he interprets his dream. He says, when you go back to the Pharaoh, and when you go back, can you tell them, and can you remember me? Joseph doesn't want to stay in prison for something he didn't do. Joseph is being responsible in all of the things that he's done. And Joseph probably feels so alone. And he doesn't want to be imprisoned in this place anymore. Even though he does have full responsibility, he is still considered a slave. He is still considered a prisoner. And he feels alone. And so he asks the cupbearer, he says, can you remember me after you get free? And yet it says in the last verse in chapter 40, verse 23, and the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but he forgot him. And that's the ending of chapter 40. That's the ending of this portion of Joseph's story. Have you ever felt that you were alone and that you were forgotten? Because it's very clear that in this moment, Joseph feels alone and forgotten. He's been attending to the cupbearer and the baker for some time, and the baker got hung and the cupbearer went free. And so the people that he was attending to, the people he got to know, the people he cared for, the people he observed and got to know about them, probably shared childhood stories and everything, how they got to that point, they were now gone. And now Joseph, again, is alone and forgotten about. And that's the end of this story in part 1. But have you ever felt alone and forgotten about? What did Joseph do to encourage himself in this time? It doesn't really say. But we can speculate, right? We can speculate, and we can see that Joseph kept on depending on God. And then we can go back to the previous chapter, and it says God's love was steadfast, and God continued to reveal himself to Joseph. And in this time, we can see that Joseph sought the promises of God. And in this time of him being alone, he probably reflected on his childhood, he probably reflected on the memories, and he probably reflected on the promises that God made to Joseph's forefathers. He probably said, because we can see that Joseph has been faithful through this whole time. And Joseph continues to seek God in him being alone and him being forgotten about. And I don't know about you, but I mean, I've been there. I've been in situations where I thought, man, I'm alone, and I feel like I am the only person that is going through this. And in those moments, God, in his rich love and his mercy and his grace, he comes in and he reminds us that we're not alone. And this is just a reminder for you today, as well as for me today, that we are not alone. Even in proximity, if we are the only one physically alone, God reminds us that we're not alone. That he is with us in our thoughts, he is with us in our emotions, and he is with us through all things. That even though we may seem like we're alone, we're not alone. And he cares for us deeply. And Joseph was in a land that was contrary to things of who God was. He was in a land where thousands of gods were being worshipped. He was in a land where Pharaoh was the epitome of the idol to worship in that scenario. And but yet Joseph continued to stay steadfast and to remember who God was. And in the end, Joseph was forgotten about, but this isn't the end of Joseph's story. This is only kind of like the middle of part of Joseph's story. And we can see in the midst of Joseph being alone and forgotten about and experiencing an array of emotions, that he was able to stay steadfast. And I don't know about you, but if Joseph could probably stay steadfast in that and probably look back on the things that God had spoken to him and be encouraged by that, I think we can too. God's probably spoken something to you a long time ago, and you've forgotten it. And my prayer is for you that the Lord would remind you of who you are and who he's made you to be and what he has spoken to you and about you a long time ago. So in this season of you feeling alone and forgotten about and frustrated and sad and mad, that God is with you in that, and it's okay to experience those emotions, and that there's hope for the future, that hope is ever present, that God reminds us of who we are and who he is, because there's something greater for us than in this specific moment now. And we can just take heart in that, and we can take heart in who God is, and that our story hasn't ended yet, just like Joseph's story hasn't ended yet. So let's pray. God, I'm just so thankful for who you are and for who you continue to be in my life and in our life, that you continue to show yourself faithful even when we feel alone. And so, God, we just give everything that we have to you, any responsibility that we have in our life. We literally lift up our hands and we give it to you. Anything that we've been given, we lift up our hands and we give it to you. Anything that we feel, sad, mad, happy, alone, forgotten, God, we don't want to hold on to that, but we want to give it to you, because we know that you can fill us with more of you. And that is what we need. And that is what Joseph relied on. So God, we just are thankful, and we continue to rely on you in everything that we do. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you, Harvest Assembly, for joining us today. We'll see you next week.